May your engagements be radical. Welcome to Radical Engagements here at Barnblog. Today we are taking a side tour to something necessary to discuss more stuff on Bordiga before we get to DeLeo and theses. We've gone through a lot of the history. We've gone through some of the broader things. This is going to be a long series and a series of long series that I'm doing. But I think we do have to get some context for Gramsci in this period. Gramsci's fascinating because he's like, there's more books about Gramsci than I think I've ever dealt with, and yet the prison notebooks are still not completely published. Just pointing that out. Like, all the prison notebooks, to the best of my ability, the last 2 volumes were never translated in English. So, there you go. Nonetheless, we're going to get into the uses and abuses of Gramsci. I used to hate Gramsci because he was misused so often by both the liberals and the right. But now I'm going to go into the situation a little bit. All right. So this is another David Broder piece. This is from 2021. So way more recent than the last Broder piece I read from the Weekly Worker. I think this is a good piece and gets to some key issues. The misuses of Gramsci. Quoted by charlatans to provide an air of magic, praised for his ambiguities, more revered than read, asterisk, more revered than even translated, and more secondary sources about him than I can shake a stick at, and yet a lot of the primary sources are still not completely translated. David Broder calls for a serious engagement with a political strategy that has considerable relevance. To accuse others of misuses of Gramsci might sound like a defense of some stale orthodoxy. But the challenge is, if anything, to assert the communist character of the Sardinian Marxist actual work in face of its dominant political and academic uses, i.e., liberal focus and conservatives' demonization of cultural Marxism or of cultural hegemony. In a famous 1976 book, Perry Anderson counted Gramsci among the first generation of so-called Western Marxists, on a way of thinkers contraposed to the construction of socialism in the Eastern Bloc. Now, we've talked about why this is a problematic before. See my interview on Western Marxism with Stephen Hamill for why. In the then Trotskyist influence Anderson's reading, and in the more acid tones of Domenico Lacerda's more recent work, Perry Anderson thought Western Marxism was distinct but good. Domenico Lacerda, Carlos Garrido, etc., think Western Marxism is bad. Western Marxism has come to represent a gradual distancing of Marxist analysis from any connection to party building or political practice. What we might call the degeneration into Euro-communism or post-Marxism, depending. One of the many things that happened in the 1970s in Europe. Such trend intensified over the first half of the 20th century. Hence, currents like the Frankfurt School were focused on academic production rather than writing for party newspapers. As Anderson notes, the complication of a figure like Gramsci, who reached maturity in the period of World War I, is that he only partly embodies such a tendency. True, Gramsci wrote most of his important theoretical work in jail from 1929 to 1935, when he had already been cut off from any direct political involvement. Yet his fragmentary prison notebooks have a strong orientation towards political strategy. They were fundamentally built on the question of how a communist party could build its leadership in a Western society, unlike Tsarist Russia. But they were also, unlike his earlier interventions, in a form as well as content. They made only elusive, if sometimes telling, references to Comintern's affairs, to the Stalin-Trotsky split and such like, yet also raised historical political questions that could later inform academic discussions from South Asian alternate studies to South Asian subaltern studies to cultural theory to international relations. You can already see the problems here, right? We have a person who wrote ambiguously, who wrote in code. I mean, this is also true for the earlier Frankfurt School. Once the Frankfurt School comes to America, and the second generation of the Frankfurt School, which is a Horkheimer generation, there was a generation before Horkheimer and Adorno, peeps. And the second generation of the Frankfurt School, initially they wrote in code. Critical theory was a code for Marxism, etc. But eventually it became something separate. I feel like it probably did in the 1940s and 50s, although it is unclear to me whether or not you can say that it was no longer Marxist or if it was a special subform of Marxism. I can already hear Chris Catrone and Spencer Leonard yelling at me about that. But anyway, that's my take on the matter. With Gramsci, you don't have anything like that. Gramsci's used by academics, but wasn't one. He was very cagey in his political notebooks. And we have to remember, like, as a contrast to Bordiga, Bordiga took like a vow of political silence during this time period. He didn't say anything. That is not the case for Gramsci, who tried to work stuff out in code in prison notebooks. So here we go. For some, this can be taken as broadly a positive thing, making Gramsci's work timeless or at least constitutively malleable or open. Indeed, in a preface to a recent edited collection, Frederick Jameson argues that the value of Gramsci lies precisely in his ambiguity. Yeah. I mean, you can do a lot with ambiguities because you can use them as a ventriloquist dummy. I think to use a lot of the words that I've been talking about recently, Gramsci is a polyglot figure. He speaks dialogically, and that's some of the benefit of ambiguities is that that's allowed, but we can make hay out of that and, like, you know, almost turn him into a mystic or something. In jail, his writings had to pass via the fascist prison authorities before they were handed back to him, so he resorted to various circumlocutions designed to avoid setting off alarm signals. Hence, the philosophy of praxis stands in for Marxism, the modern prince for the Communist Party, and so on. Jameson suggests that if these disguises were imposed by an external situation, they may also express a more complex and internal subjective one, which might have led Gramsci himself in the course of seeking alternative phrasing to wholly new paths and new problems. You know, this is the Jamesonian line. But this also points to a problem addressed by this article: the removal of the historical actor at the center of his outlook. Jameson, in common with most academic uses of the Sardinian, breezily skips across his central focus on the Communist Party and its tasks. Indeed, for cultural theorists, its application of Gramscian categories to the subjects and situations which he could never have imagined that, quote, makes up for the freshness and adaptability of his thinking. It's suggesting this as a resource for contemporary theory, if not as some model party line that he never offered in the first place. Further, it is, quote, in precisely the ambiguity of Gramsci's analysis of this or that issue or topic that makes for the richness of his work and its urgent relevance for us today. Those are both Jameson quotes. One aspect might sound compelling. Gramsci would not be of much use if he merely described the particular realities of his own time. His call for an allegiance to the southern peasantry and the northern industrial worker is not just of interest for historians of the interwar Italy, but also offers an innovative approach to the age-old problem posed by Marx, whose critique of the Goethe program, another touchback to another long series we're doing here, challenged Ferdinand Lassalle's notion of the non-proletarian population as one reactionary mass. This is actually interesting because I've heard Marxists, particularly some Trotskyists, refer to peasants as one reactionary mass, which is something that the Goethe critique is critical of, that's too simple. A lot of vulgar statist Marxism is actually Lassalleanism. And when people tell me that I'm being unfair and pointing that out, I always kind of laugh. Maybe you're a Lassallean. Anyway, equally, Gramsci's focus on culture, meaning not just the arts, but something rather like common sense, the space between the economic and political tactics in which hegemony is exercised, hardly needs to be reduced to the immediate situation of interwar Italy, or indeed the particular fascination that exerted by the rising U.S. hegemon and Fordist model of the worker. I mean, there's a lot to unpack there, but it is interesting that cultural hegemony is really popular in the place that is a literal political hegemon, nonetheless. Yet it seems odd to suggest that the interest of using and building on Gramsci's categories in our own time should rely on them being ambiguous. By analogy, Marxist focus on the factory as a center of the productive process and capital may bear many traits of the expectations of his time and needs to be properly historicized. But to recognize this would in no way rely on exploiting elements of equivocation or ambiguity in his writing. Although, asterisk, a lot of post-Marxists do exactly that. playing on like, well, you know, this notion of value versus this notion, like some ethical normative notion of value versus the surplus value in capital, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. This is done a lot, particularly in the French post-Marxist school. So it's not like it's alien to us, but it is less common. Whereas with Gramsci and with Benjamin, it's super common. But to recognize this would in no way rely on exploiting elements of equation or ambiguity as webbing. When we take him seriously as a theorist and not just as a subject of literary interpretation, bingo. In fact, we have to look at the history of the socialist and communist parties in the early 20th century. We nowhere find a majority industrial working class, which existed still less in Marx's lifetime. It is thus puzzling to be confronted with the assumption that Gramsci's ideas of the multiform working class, allied with other subaltern groups, challenge some pre-existing monolithism. Yeah, I mean, particularly when you're talking about from Leninism, which already posited the dictatorship of the proletariat and peasant in the periphery economies, are what would then be called the backwards economies. All right, such portrayals of Gramsci, focusing on his ambiguities or heterodoxy more than his contributions to the Communist Party, are broadly characteristic of both the immediate political uses and scholarly fashions. Aside from a rejection of Leninism, this phenomenon seems to be especially driven by academic tendency to assert individual ownership of ideas. Indicative in this regard is the attribution to Gramsci of the idea of hegemony, the combination of consent and coercion, you know, that also Althusser works out in a more, at least prosaic way, with one group or class establishing leadership over others while disregarding its earlier use in the Russian social democracy. Equally, if Gramsci is often upheld as the apostle of radical culture and popular education outside of conventional political domain, it is strange that such a presentation of him should overlook the experience of the German SPD. Perhaps because this party and its early versions of a vulgarized Marxism are less palatable than the Sardinian prisoner. I do love David Broder's tendency to call him the Sardinian. Anyway, in this, we could identify a certain comparison with Rosa Luxemburg, more widely celebrated as a martyr than read. The acclaim for her is all the more unanimous because she was murdered before the decisive splits in the communist movement. Just as most currents on the left have some positive myths of Gramsci, Luxemburg's early death allowed her to be an icon of both the German Democratic Republic and the libertarian post-Leninism, are indeed a radical Democrat at odds with Bolshevism, or sometimes even an anarchist. In Gramsci's case, the irony is that his image of the trappings of heterodoxy and national particularity itself owes much to his use in the high Stalinist era. Togliatti's Gramsci. Founded in 1921, the Communist Party of Italy gained a huge popularity during the anti-fascist resistance of 1943 through 45. That's when a lot of people gained huge popularity. The same is true of the U.S. Communist Party right after World War II, as it became a major player in a broad anti-fascist alliance. Banished from the cross-party government in 1947 as a Cold War hardened, it would for the next 4 decades remain a loyal opposition within the Christian Democratic-dominated system. In this situation, the PCI followed its leader, Palmiro Togliatti, called the Italian Road to Socialism. Kind of like the Chinese Road to Socialism. Everyone's always got their particular deviations that they want to then reify. Based on a broad democratic alliance, and in particular, the Republican institutions that helped to create immediately after 1945. This was also not unique to Italy. We also see this in France. In Italy, in some ways, it was more severe, but a tendency to even disregard third periodism, disregard the Comintern's policies prior to its dissolution, and to adopt a kind of broad Republican, you can't call it Broderist in this context, but like social patriotic view. In fact, from the Comintern 7th Congress in 1935 onwards, all communist parties adopted a national and patriotic hues. Yep. and then they got purged for it later. All right, the Italian party was more successful than most in giving it a distinct theoretical underpinning. While in France, the leader Maurice Thorez was the object of Stalinist leadership cult, in Italy, the uncharismatic Togliatti instead relied on his association with the martyred Gramsci. And this is often why I often thought I hated Gramsci myself. Right, the Italian party's democratic mores were particularly shaped by the fact that it was crushed so early in its development. Asterisk. I do find it interesting that like Gramsci's the first Western Marxist, and they're like, "Oh, he's opposed to the Soviet Union." I'm like, but the dude was a Marxist-Leninist. He was a centrist Marxist-Leninist, and Marxist-Leninism had not really taken on its distinctive flavor before he was in prison. So there's that. Nonetheless, he was still in that tradition. Thanks to Mussolini's appointment as prime minister in October 1922, we've already discussed this in several other essays, and the near eradication of the communist organization by the end of 1926. This also affected its internal structure. While the Stalin loyalist apparatus did take from the Paris and Moscow after 1926 with ramifications among clusters of prisoners and internal exiles, most militants in Italy were little able to follow the twist of the Comintern policy after the 1930s. As in France and Spain, the PCI leaders helped build a popular front alliances, and they also purged the clandestine party of its founding leader, Amedeo Bordiga, Trotskyist opponents of the Hitler-Stalin Pact, and the like, but they had no disciplined structures in their homeland. The decisive effort to create such a party instead came after the German invasion of the September 1943, as a renascent PCI formed as a resistance alliance with the Christian Democrats, the Liberals, the Socialists, and from April 1944, the Monarchists. Jesus, we're starting with monarchists, kind of like the French communists fighting with the Gaullists. Just, ugh. Anyway, in the partisan movement itself, the PCI was the largest force. Its units organizing around half of the resistance recruits. Returning from 2 decades of exile in March 1944, Togliatti created a new party, totally unlike that which had existed in 1921 to 1926, both in its focus on the mass organization, whether on cadres and program, and its concern to build cross-class alliances. Cross-class alliances. Now, I don't know what had cross-class alliances led to before. Now, I say that as a person who also thinks that, like, the idea that everybody's reactionary who's not a worker is false, but, Yes, such a force could hardly be created with no reference to the party of 1921 to 1926. Gramsci, who had been jailed at the end of his first period and died in 1937, provided the essential link. While the two men were allies in marginalizing Bordiga from the leadership of the party in 1923 to 1924, Gramsci had ended comradely relations with Togliatti in October 1926, when the latter refused to pass on the Russian leadership his letter critical of the tone of the exchange with the left opposition. So Togliatti refused to pass on Gramsci's kind of mild rebuke at how harsh they were with the left opposition in both Russia and in Italy. Yet Togliatti, through the clandestine period to the undisputed PCI leader, became the king, a kind of literary executor. In Moscow, he came into the possession of the prison notebooks. Gramsci had written them between 1929 and 1935, expressing his wish to leave some trace for Ewig, for eternity. For Ewig. Yet these writings came to light was contradictory. As an assertion of specifically Italian tradition, but within the parameters of a party whose organizational model and popular front strategy were essentially creations of the Stalin era Comintern. And indeed, the use of Gramsci in the war period is remarkable, considering the very low knowledge of him amongst the communist base. This was largely owing to the membership. After 1921, this had been in the low tens of thousands and fell to 5,000 in 1926. They lost a lot when they kicked out Bordiga and co, by the way, just something to note. Yet the PCI's rapid growth during the resistance and after saw it hit almost 2 million members by the end of the 1940s. For most, Gramsci was a famous martyr, or a name given to partisan units rather than someone read and understood. Over the first months of September 1943, the PCI had to confront the sizable currents which harkened back to the class war intransigence of the first years. Rome's Bandera Rosa outstripped the PCI's own membership. Turin's Stella Rosa was about half the size. Yet, striking in their text too is the absence of any reference to Gramsci as a distinct thinker. Less governed by their allegiance to dissidents like Trotsky or Bordiga than by generic defense of the party's original tradition. Yeah, this is one of the things about left communists. Bordiga as the primary thinker of Bordigism is actually kind of a late development. We'll get back to that. Those currents preferred to ignore the clashes of the pre-1926 years and showing their political confusion, often even invoke Stalin on their side as the great continuer of the October Revolution. Upon his return from exile in the late March 1944, soon bringing the party into a broad anti-German pro-Allied government, Togliatti invoked Gramsci both to buttress his own prestige and to counter those more impatient militants who wanted to do like Russia. Yet the Gramsci used it to this end and championed by Togliatti and the PCI's organ La Unida, the Unity, appeared as a guise of a martyr of fascism rather than the bearer of a distinct and immediately applicable political strategy. Gramsci was the object of reference. Togliatti's articles in April 1944 identified him as the party's founder, thus memory holding Bordiga, and mentioned the existence of the prison notebooks, albeit without referencing their specific contents. In this lies a great irony of the Italian communist history. Gramsci is often rightly praised for his democratic understanding of political theory, explaining that every man is an intellectual, though not all have the social function of intellectuals. The irony is that the creation of a folk Gramsci in the war period effectively reproduced this same division, laying a massive tombstone over many green shoots of working class communist thought during the resistance period. This underground culture remains widely ignored despite the vast amounts of source material available to those willing to look. All you have to do is read Italian, guys. One of the reasons why Italian Marxism is so interesting to cover is we have so much of it, even though it hasn't all been translated into English. A lot of it hasn't been translated in English. And again, like with German, not a hard language to translate into English, so it must be right or some other reason. Anyway, an interesting recent trend in historiography presented, for instance, by Andrew Bonnell and Jean-Numa Ducangi, I think, has questioned how far the militants actually read or understood classic works. Telling in this regard is Paolo Falli's History of the Italian Marxism. Focused on the pre-World War I era, it explores Marx's influence on academic disciplines like sociology and the spread of his writings and ideas and movements that emerged in the late 19th century. The case of the Communist Manifesto is illustrative. The German edition, published in February 1948, announced the forthcoming translations into English, French, Italian, Danish, and Flemish. But the first partial Italian version did not come out until 1889, 6 years after Marx's death. That probably has something to do with the split in the First International, to be honest. One of the interesting things is the founders of Italian socialism have an interesting relationship to the Bakunin side of that split. Anyway, Favilli shows how knowledge of Marx and Dead spread through the popular explainers. The texts of anti-socialist intellectuals are indeed, via the anarchist-influenced circles, hegemonic in the Italian sections of the First International. That's what I was talking about. The anarchist-influenced Italian circles actually provided a lot of the first Marxists, despite the split in Italy. That's an interesting history. It's beyond the scope of what I'm writing about right now, but it's something to think about. But they also impose their assumptions on him. In the autodidact workers' press, Marx could be misrepresented as a defender of Lassalle's iron law of wages, a vulgarized economic literalism, held alongside Garibaldi and Bakunin, or even painted as a horseman galloping across Europe spreading revolution, an obviously un-Marxist perspective projected onto this friend of the working man. In his own 1925 Introduction to the Communist Party School course, Gramsci would refer to Marx as a figure less read by Marxists than by their opponents, using him as a dressing for their own indigestible sauces. Oh, Gramsci, when you're good, you're good. All right. In Gramsci's case, he appeared in terms of consonant with Togliatti's own strategy. in a world born of the Yalta Accords. The Gramsci of 1944 was thus cast as the first Leninist in Italy, an attack on any residential admiration of Bordiga, himself also a Leninist, but also a champion of the party for the whole Italian people. While young anti-fascist intellectuals entering the PCI's ranks, he also became the endpoint of a national progressive philosophic tradition, a nationalization that gained momentum during the post-1946 de-Stalinization. As for the prison notebooks, the edition published by Togliatti and Felice Platon from 1948 onward were both condensed into thematic volumes, giving them a falsely finished and systematic character, much derided by academic philologists, and also censored the troubling references to parliamentarianism, Bordiga, Luxemburg, or Trotsky. Ooh, ouch. But Gramsci's symbolism far exceeded these volumes, which were read by few. The Martyr was, above all, a cipher for the PCI's claim to be a democratic party of all Italians, united by anti-fascism and the values of the Constitution written after the war. The party's broad national popular allegiances, seeking to win over intellectuals, peasants, white-collar employees, and small-town shopkeepers, were soon loosely wrapped around Gramsci's notion of hegemony. Yet its framing in terms of progressive democracy rather than class conflict was a narrowing of Gramsci's approach within the limits imposed by a real hegemon, U.S. imperialism, which exerted far more military, financial, and cultural pressure on Italy than any force had after the previous war. The PCI should nonetheless be credited with the real achievement after 1945, imposing the right to organize despite often deadly reprisals from ex-fascists and their CIA, church, and mafia allies, and even assassination attempts on Togliatti himself. For 30 years, Italy was not Greece, and that had a great deal of positive impact on Italian democracy and working-class life. Yes, there's more working-class life in Italy than Greece for this reason. That's foreign talking. But there was a certain... while there were certainly real gains, the rhetoric of the post-war constitution even promised a democratic republic based on labor. That's crazy. What remained unclear was the PCI's practical project for transcending its position as a subordinate, loyal opposition. This affects Italian politics for a long time, and not in a way that's good for communists or really for anybody. It was understood that it would build up its forces through gradual accretion, war opposition, but unclear what the eventual war maneuver might look like, as social transformation was now defined mainly in negative terms, as not storming the Winter Palace or the insurrectionary Aura X imagined by many militants. Euro-communist ? The Russia of 1917 lost its model status. During the 1958 election campaign, Sputniks had adorned the PCI's election imagery, but the events of 1956 and even more so the Prague Spring tarnished the appeal to the workers' fatherland. This is also one of the weird things about both Perry Anderson and Domenico Lacerda going after Gramsci, is that Gramsci's a lot of the divisions that caused the Western Marxist spirit, which is mostly the Prague Spring and the Hungarian Revolution, nonetheless. But also the PCI's position as a latent anti-capitalist force in national politics was brought into question, not the least after Togliatti's death in 1964. Especially notable here was the PCI's weakness in promoting any specific reformist project. Leading gradualists like Giorgio Amendola focused on the inherent backwardness of Italian capitalism and the need for modernization. Yet such a stance was confused by the rapid economic growth of the 1950s and 60s, while the decline of post-war Keynesianism left the PCI in a particular quagmire. That happened to a lot of people, my friends. That's what led to autonomism in a lot of ways, and operaismo. Following the example of the smaller socialist PSI, which joined the Social Democrats' Adoro Moro administration in 1963, we would kill Moro eventually. In the 1970s, the PCI leader Enrico Berlinguer advocated a historic compromise with Moro's party. That sounds like France, doesn't it? Like the Mitterrand and the communists, which he emphasized would also avoid the antagonism that led to the 1973 coup in Chile. So we wouldn't have another Allende. Reaching its electoral high watermark in 1976 with 34% support, Over the next 3 years, the PCI provided external support to the Christian Democratic government, backing wage restraints in the interest of combating inflation, a sure sign of how it was being hegemonized by others, even in the name of a broad democratic alliances. The Euro-communist trend in the late 1970s was, on a whole, a particularly suggestive route away from Leninism. If the PCI had long defined its notion of revolution as not a repeat of the Russian October, Berlinger's 1981 statement was, the propulsive force that began an October revolution has been exhausted. Formalized the end of the idea of a revolutionary transformation of society. Yeah, they gave up before 1992. We see some evidence of this in Eric Hobsbawm's 1977 book, Interview with Giorgio Napolitano, illustrating the replacement of the socialist end goal with notions like democratic programming, sustainable capitalist development, and so on. Both the PCI's Leninist origins and, in a contradictory way, the fact that it had mounted an armed struggle even to secure the basic democratic rights, allowed the persistence of certain insurrectionary ideas of revolution compounded by the far effective inability to international government during the Cold War period. Yet well before its dissolution, the PCI clearly lacked even a reformist program of transformation. The implosion of 1991 showed it to be somehow less than the sum of its part, as both the more reformist and revolutionary currents entered a death spiral. Ouch. Abroad, Eurocommunism meant both a democratic road to socialism held by what was already long been the West's largest CP, and a tilt away from the industrial working class. This itself was fueled interest in Gramsci, and not all the results were bad. An analysis of Thatcherism's counter-revolution in Britain, Stuart Hall's work represents a fine, if not uncontroversial, application of Gramscian categories outside of Italy. Yet Hall's work is obviously marked by its disconnect with the Transformary Project, which is Gramsci's own work was centered on. Marxism today's vision of a broad alliance is against Thatcherism, and in this spirit, the embrace of D.L. Kinnock and his war on the left sought not to create a new alliance around the rising layers of the working class, but to write off the old bases of strength and instead tail small social movements, NGOs, and the like. How many times have we seen that happen? How many times after the 1960s have we seen that happen? All right. If Hall's trajectory was somehow tragic, today it has been farcical re-edition and the repeated evocations of Gramsci by last Trotskyist Paul Mason. Ooh, stab, Mason, stab Paul Mason. All right. Don't actually stab Paul Mason. We're not promoting violence against Paul Mason here. Ideologically stab him. All right. His political training, still visible in his frequent uses of Comintern era analogies, would, I imagine, led him to consider Tagliagli a Stalinist hatchet man and a purveyor of nationalism and popular frontist dogma. Yet Mason himself uses Gramsci as an apostle of, quote, the meeting of people where they are at, asterisk. There's a lot of British ex-Trotskyism that ends up being both super reformist and also weirdly pro-Stalinophobic and Stalinophilic simultaneously. Ugh. Anyway. Using his Starmerite agenda of concessions to popular nationalism, strong national defense, standing up to Russia, ad nuclearatum. Yet Gramsci said that the Workers' Party must establish its moral and intellectual leadership in society as a whole, but this in no way implies swallowing up the imperatives of bourgeois politics, are posing as better exponents of existing hegemonic values. Cough, cough, that's what tailism does. Cough, 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 stop doing it. Cough, cough, varn. Such a shallow use of big-name intellectuals reminds us why the village priests in County Mayo speak in Latin, not to convey information, but to add an air of magic. Even amid the general association of Gramsci with Berlinger's turn and the retreat from class, there were left Euro-communist thinkers who were engaged more with the realities of the interwar Comintern. Indicative is Nicholas Palansas' reading of the state as both the terrain of struggle and the material condensates of power relations between class and class fractions. This had the quality of neither understanding it as a monolithic fortress to be assaulted from outside, nor not even taking it to be an empty terrain in which a democratic will would assert itself, like most social democrats pretend that they don't do today, but still do. But rather a constitutional order that had been partly shaped by the movement of the working class breakthrough and the conservative reaction against them. Yes. The PCI's own idealized characterizations of the Italian Republic in its constitution, whose first articles declared it a democratic republic founded on labor, if anything, presented less a conflictual vision, more naively confident in the gradual advances of progress. Palansas went well beyond a purely instrumental reading of the state by recognizing the separate interest of individual capitalists in the overall reproduction of capitalism. Bing, bing, bing. When people think that disciplining one capitalist equals disciplining capitalism, they are being idiotic. They're actually committing a part-to-whole fallacy, but nonetheless, they're also being stupid. But this autonomization of the political level was taken to the extreme by the likes of Chantal Mouffe and Arnaud Local, whose 1985 hegemony and socialist strategy bid finally to free Gramsci from any connection to the economic base and to set a political strategy on a fundamental superstructural discursive plane. All mediation all the time, but what are we mediating? That's Warren again. But where the PCI had taken the industrial proletariat as the core of the broad popular alliance, Local Mouffe left populism removes even this hegemonic center. And by the way, this is going to be the dominant thing that leads to things like Podemos and parts of Syriza and the rebirth of the DSA and the populist moment of the aught teens. So much bad begins here. All right. Their postmodern vision of politics does without immediate institutions, militants, cadres, programs, and so on. It is, in effect, another variant of the colonization of politics by marketing. Broder, get on. Preach it, brother Broder. All right. Notable also in its complete focus on the steps towards electoral breakthrough, not towards the transformation of the state. Syriza's foundation is named after Palansas. In practice, it owes more to Local Mouffe. Boom. The French philosopher Louis Althusser identified the reasons why Gramsci's own work leads to the misuse of this kind. The Sardinian lack of study of political economy and was focused on the historical moments of the formation of hegemony tends to overshadow the idea of modes of production with that of hegemony and historical blocks. Now, Althusser is actually critiquing Gramsci. One of the humanists Althusser is critiquing is Gramsci, but Althusser actually really takes a lot from Gramsci, and his notions of ideological and state repressive apparatuses owe a lot to Gramsci's notions of hegemony, but Althusser does try to replace them in some kind of, I think, somewhat vulgarized social political economic context. Anyway, partyism. Gramsci does not deserve the epigons such as these. Of course, any theorist's work must be able to be kept alive, renewed, and built upon, but the dominant uses of Gramsci's work, in fact, evacuate its core function. The building of a communist party for a socialist transformation of the state and society in the conditions unlike Russia in 1917, which, by the way, you live in conditions unlike Russia in 1917. Even if you're in Russia, you live in conditions unlike Russia in 1917. Come on, stop it. All right, back to the text. Many seeking to recover Gramsci from Togliatti's tradition, notably the new left of the 1960s and figures like Leo Basso, looked particularly fondly on its councilist period in 1919-1920. Everyone was a councilist in 1919-1920 because that's what the Soviet Union was doing with Soviets. Anyway, when during the occupation of the factories and the creation of the workers' commissions, Gramsci saw them as embryos of the Soviets, just like Lukács saw them, just like the Council Communists saw them, just like a lot of people who were left of the Kosgeites saw them. This focus on bottom-up democracy has evident attractions for those looking for an alternative of the failed models of the 20th century socialism. Yet, the most interesting thing about Gramsci, and indeed the most relevant for us now, lies precisely in his critical revaluation of this experience and his activity within the Communist Party of Italy between 1921 and 1926. This is anything but a spotless record. We can again make comparisons to Rosa Luxemburg, whose leadership of the pre-1914 social democracy of Poland and Lithuania showed she was no generic defender of the right to think differently. The imposition of Gramsci's center over the left leadership of Bordiga was orchestrated by the Comintern and never approved by the mass of militants. Ironically, Mr. Anti-Democracy Bordiga was actually more popular. democratically. The ironies never cease. Anyway. In Gramsci's development between 1920 and 1930, there were, in fact, several moments of reflection. First drawing him closer to Bordiga, then setting them to an opposition to each other. Then a period where the reconciliation and restored ties, something that neither Bordigists or Gramscians tend to talk about. I'll give Broder credit for that. In the period of the factory councils in Turin, Bordiga had strongly challenged the idea that these were embryonic Soviets, in particular emphasizing that in Russia, the Soviets were political organs, not representations of a workplace, syndicates. Workplace representation is syndicalism. Soviets councils are in charge of more than just a shop. Anyway, that's the difference between syndicalism and councilism, and people who try to say that like councilism is a regression to syndicalism don't really seem to understand either syndicalism or councilism. All right. Indeed, if in 1919 to 1920, Gramsci often emphasized the notion that the workplace councils could be bases of the future proletarian state, an outlook not least conditioned by the extremely weak leadership provided by the Socialist Party, the inability of the factory occupations to be led a broad movement of the subaltern classes across Italy helped convince him of the centrality of the Communist Party, able to produce a collective will standing above the sectional and localist divides. It kind of does, and then it doesn't, and then it leads to operaismo, which is actually dealing with sectional and localist divides while trying to keep them within the Communist Party, 50 years later from this. All right. Important differences remained, however, not only over tactical questions of anti-fascism, but also of the two men's conceptions of the role of the party. While with Gramsci's position was also strongly distancing him from the commonplace Trotskyist notion of a vanguard which can exploit a latent but unrealized class consciousness. Where Bordiga's vision of the party had essentially relied on a building of a militarized cadre organization, which would be swept into the limelight by a capitalist collapse, Gramsci sought to build the scaffolding of working class democracy. The aim here was to provide a platform on which organized, political, educated, and militant part of the working class could prepare itself to lead the wider class, constantly fed and informed, but not subaltern to the various demands from below. If rooted in Lenin's conception of the party of professional revolutionaries, Gramsci also went beyond it with his focus on the political education of the broad membership. Asterisk. That was the point of the cadre of professional revolutionaries that Lenin and also Kautsky promoted, was that it would enable an easy education of the broad membership. Gramsci may have focused on that more than Lenin did, but it was definitely there in Lenin. I'm not normally a big Lenin defender, but yeah, come on, let's be fair here. Hence, far from the McLeod-style vision of the party as an empty cipher or various kinds of direct democracy implied in councilism, don't insult councilism, Gramsci emphasized that the party was not democratic in the vulgar sense. It sought not to mirror popular prejudice or common sense opinion, but to create the tools with which to mold it. As such, he particularly sought to marry centralization with a kind of communist pedagogy, through which the worker leader would emerge and forge a collective will. Bordiga, rather like Lenin in this discussion of building state capitalism in Russia, insisted that only after the revolution would improved material conditions make it possible to raise the cultural level of the masses. But this was precisely the focus of Gramsci's activity from the worker writings of L'Ordre Nouveau period onward, where Gramsci is often held as analysis of the subaltern speech. Much more rarely do we examine his political record in creating the platform on which working people could prepare to rule society to become the state. Aside from Stalinist and academic defamations of his thought, this is the legacy most valuable to us today. I think this actually puts Gramsci into a much more understandable context, but also doesn't get into everything element of his thought. In some way, Gramsci suffered from the fact that while he was very much concerned about class and class existence, he very much thought the party had to approach it in a pedagogical manner, which I think all Marxists in some ways think it does. Even the invariant progressivism of Bordiga requires a pedagogical component. even the Trotskyist vanguard theory is based on, the reason why there's a vanguard is because they will lead to better leadership that will merge with the broader population workers, and that's generally speaking what vanguardism historically was. Now, it leads to being cynically abused. It tends to try to make the class speak monolithically and monologically, which is always a mistake. And if anything, that's a mistake I see communists do all the time. Ironically, it was in the Soviet Union from kind of heterodox literary theorists who themselves kind of dealt with this. But nonetheless, it is what it is. Like, you have the panoply of speech and you have to deal with it. The class never speaks completely separate or completely atomized from each other, but it never speaks in absolute unison as a singular monologue either. And Gramsci tries to deal with that in ways that probably don't deal with political economy enough. And also because he's writing code. What are you going to do? But this idea that he was just a vulgar, Marxist, Leninist, Sovietizer, Bolshevizationizer, I do think his participation in the Bolshevization of the party actually ended up being a very, very, very big mistake. And it was attempted to be undone by Apparismo and Autonomia later on. But nonetheless, it was a mistake rooted in something very real. We'll go back to Bordiga in this series. I need to get back to finishing up the On Authority cycle 2, because that's the precursor to this. You can kind of see that there is a method to my madness on all these long series of articles and stuff that get you guys to listen to, read, and process. This is a pedagogical, historical thing that I'm using other people's work to build and comment on, to get you to kind of get into these ideas and develop them and see them as case studies and examples of how we would build our own programmatic system to empower worker leadership in the future. And with that, protect your peace, like and subscribe, hit the bell. Don't let the hegemons get you.